Story 2, Strings in the Branches. It was mid-September when I decided to hike near Pine Hollow again. The mornings had started to turn cool, and the sky had that washed-out early fall look that makes the hills seem endless. Pine Hollow isn't on any official map, not anymore. My father told me they stopped maintaining the trails back in the late 80s after a fire took out a chunk of the forest, though when you walk it now, you'd never guess there was ever a fire. The trees grow close together, their canopies knitted so tightly that most of the forest floor is in shadow even at midday. That's what I've always liked about it. It feels older than the rest of the woods around here. Like it's been there since before people knew the names of things. I was following what I thought was an old deer path. It was narrow, overgrown, but something about the way the ground dipped and the leaves were pressed down told me it was still used. Just not by many. I'd been walking maybe 40 minutes when I saw the first strand stretched between two trees at shin height. It caught the light in a strange way, so thin I almost missed it. At first I thought it was a fishing line, some careless hunter's leftover, but when I bent to look closer I realized it was cloth, frayed and sun-faded, knotted tight around a short stick jammed into the bark. The stick had been carved. Not in any way I recognized. There were straight lines intersecting at odd angles with tiny notches along the edges. It wasn't decorative, and it wasn't letters. I don't know why I thought this, but it felt like something that had a purpose, and it was pointed, angled deliberately toward the deeper woods. The second strand was 20 feet further on, tied the same way, pointing the same direction. Then I started noticing more, each one spaced just far enough apart that you'd think you imagined the last. The path beneath my boots began to feel less like a game trail and more like something mapped out, something intentional. The deeper I went, the heavier the air felt. The usual sounds of the woods, birds, squirrels, wind through the leaves, faded until there was nothing but my own steps and the faint rasp of my breathing. Every so often I'd catch a faint scent, like old flowers left too long in stagnant water. It was the arch that made me stop. Two thin saplings had been bent toward each other and woven together so tightly with vines and strips of that same frayed cloth that it formed a solid frame. It wasn't decorative. The way the branches locked together reminded me of a snare, something meant to hold or mark. Hanging from the very center was a deer skull, bleached pale and cracked with age. Its eye sockets had been stuffed with dried wildflowers, yellowed and brittle, the petals curling inward like fists. I can't say how long I stood there staring at it. The forest around me felt close, too close. And under that closeness, I heard it, whispering, not clear words, not even a voice exactly, just a low, almost conversational sound, like someone speaking to you from another room. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, though I never saw a single person. Something in me wanted to duck under the arch and keep going. That urge was so strong, it scared me. My whole body leaned forward without me realizing it, my boot almost touching the base of the skull before I caught myself. I turned sharply, deciding right then I'd had enough. The way back should have been simple. Follow the strands of cloth back to the start. But as I retraced my steps, I realized they weren't there anymore. The sticks, the knots, the strips of faded fabric, gone. The trees stood bare, their bark unbroken. The path felt different now too, less like a trail and more like just another stretch of forest floor. I walked faster, checking every trunk I passed for the markings. Nothing. My heartbeat was loud in my ears, and that faint whispering was still there, keeping pace with me. Sometimes it grew closer, just enough to make my skin prickle, then faded again. When I finally broke through the tree line into the gravel pull-off where I'd left my truck, I didn't even look back. I drove the whole way home with the windows up, telling myself it was just some backwoods ritual long abandoned, nothing dangerous. That night, as I sat in my living room, I glanced toward the window that faces the woods. Something fluttered past the glass, too quick to make out. I told myself it was a moth, but the next morning, hanging from the porch railing, was a strip of faded cloth, knotted tight around a small carved stick, the lines and notches angled toward the trees behind my house. Story 3, The Ash Mound at Dusk. It had been one of those early autumn afternoons where the sun was bright but didn't give much warmth, and the wind carried just enough bite to make you think about a jacket you didn't bring. I told myself I'd only go as far as the overlook on the main trail, but the woods beyond it had that quiet, sun-dappled pull that always made me curious. Before I knew it, I'd stepped past the faded orange trail marker and was picking my way along a narrow, unmarked path that curved downhill toward the backside of Coldwater Gap. The first half-mile wasn't much different than any other hike in the Appalachians. Thick underbrush, roots twisting across the ground, that faint, damp smell of leaves breaking down underfoot. But as I went farther, the light seemed to change. The sky was still clear overhead, yet it was like the color had drained out of it, leaving only pale gray filtering through the branches. I told myself it was just the angle of the sun. The forest here felt older. The trees were taller, their trunks thicker and deeply ridged. Some leaned toward each other like they were holding a private conversation I wasn't invited to. I didn't hear the normal forest sounds. No birds, no squirrels, no insects. Just the sound of my own boots pressing into the soil and the occasional distant creak of a tree swaying in the wind. I noticed the bend in the trees before I saw the clearing itself. They weren't just growing randomly. These ones tilted inward, their branches reaching toward each other across the gap above like a lopsided ribcage. The closer I got, the more I felt the air change, heavier, thicker. That was when I saw the mound. It rose from the center of the clearing like something deliberately built, not a natural hill, but a shape made by human hands. Maybe 4 feet high, steep on all sides, its surface a uniform sickly gray. I thought it was dirt at first, but as I got closer, the texture was wrong. It wasn't soil, it was ash. Fine, powdery, and strangely undisturbed, like no wind had touched it in months. The smell hit me then, faint, but sharp. Like the singed ends of hair caught in a campfire, my stomach turned a little, but my curiosity kept me moving. I circled the mound slowly, my eyes catching on the jars. They were arranged evenly around its base, maybe 12 in total. Old canning jars, cloudy from age, and a few mismatched bottles with rusted metal lids. Each one was filled to the brim with a thick, tea-colored liquid. The sunlight that filtered through the treetops caught in the glass, making the contents look almost alive. I crouched near the closest one. The liquid inside swirled lazily when I moved, and that's when I saw it. Something pale floating just beneath the surface. I leaned in, squinting until my stomach clenched. It was a cluster of tiny bones, each one carefully arranged into the shape of a small, delicate hand. A cold ripple worked its way up my spine. I straightened fast, my knees brushing another jar behind me. I hadn't even noticed it was there. My flashlight was in my hand before I'd even thought to reach for it. The beam swept across the mound, and that's when I noticed the ground. Dozens of footprints surrounded the ash pile in a perfect ring, bare footprints, deep enough to hold water if it had rained, pressed into the soft earth. I followed them around with my light, and the more I looked, the more there were, layer upon layer, overlapping in every direction, as if the same steps had been traced again and again over time. I took a step back, my heels sinking into something softer than the rest of the earth. I looked down. It was another footprint, fresh. The edges were sharp. The soil still springy. I knew without any doubt that it hadn't been there when I first walked up. I felt my heart start to beat in my throat. That's when the breathing started. It was quiet at first, just a slow pull of air, like someone trying not to be heard. Then it deepened, steady and measured. It wasn't in front of me, and it wasn't off to either side. It was right behind me, close enough that the hairs on my neck rose, close enough that I felt the faintest stir of air against my skin. I turned sharply, sweeping the flashlight into the trees, expecting to see a person. But the beam hit nothing except the close-packed trunks and the black spaces between them. The breathing didn't stop. It didn't change speed. I took one step toward the edge of the clearing. The breathing followed. Every footfall I made was matched by another, just half a beat behind mine. Not the random rustle of an animal in the brush. This was deliberate. This was someone pacing their movement to mine. I wanted to run, but I didn't trust the ground. This far off any trail, a twisted ankle could mean a long night alone in the dark, and the thought of being in this place after sundown made my skin crawl. So I walked, not slow, but steady. My eyes stayed locked on the narrow space between two leaning oaks that marked the way I'd entered. The whole time, the breathing stayed behind me, sometimes closer, sometimes just far enough away that I almost thought it had stopped. Once, I thought I felt it brush against my ear, like someone leaning in to whisper, but no words came. When I finally stepped between the two oaks and into the thicker part of the forest, the sound stopped. Just like that. I kept walking until I hit the faint path I'd followed in, my boots crunching over leaves that seemed suddenly too loud. The forest sounds didn't return, not until I was nearly half a mile from that place. Then, slowly, I heard a single bird call. Then another. Then the wind moved through the branches again. By the time I made it back to the gravel pull-off where my car was parked, the sky had gone deep orange. I got in, shut the door, and just sat there for a while, gripping the wheel. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe some old burn site. Maybe locals had left those jars for reasons I didn't want to know. That night, though, I woke to a faint smell. Ash, and underneath it, the unmistakable sting of burned hair. It seemed to be coming from the open window, drifting in with the cool night air. When I got up in the morning, there was a small grey smear on the floor beneath that window. A fine dust, soft as powder, like the kind that covers your hands after cleaning out a fire pit. I swept it up. I told myself it was just dirt. But I didn't open that window again. Story 4. Lanterns in the fog. I grew up hearing people say the mountains could trick you if you weren't careful. My grandfather used to warn me about it every time I went hiking alone. These woods will call your name in voices you know, and lead you to places you won't come back from. I never thought much of it. Sound carried strange out here. Sure, I'd heard it before, someone chopping wood a mile off, echoing like it was right next to you. But tricks, stories. That day, I was out past where the park maps ended, following an old service trail that hadn't been maintained in years. It was mid-October, the kind of cool where you can smell winter creeping in, and the ground was soft with leaves that muffled my steps. I was maybe 5 miles from my car, thinking about turning back before I lost the light. That's when the fog started rolling in. I've seen fog out here plenty, but this was different. Usually you can watch it rise slow from the valleys, a white tide spilling over the ridges, but this one came fast. Fast enough I thought maybe it was smoke from a fire somewhere nearby. It slipped between the trees like it had weight to it, filling every gap, erasing depth until the forest around me looked like an old photograph gone blurry. My flashlight barely punched 10 feet ahead. The air changed too, cooler, damper, thick enough I could feel it on my skin. I slowed down, checking my compass just to make sure I was still heading toward the old ranger shed I'd marked earlier. That's when I saw the first lantern. It hung from a low branch to my right, swaying just slightly, like it had been disturbed moments before. It was one of those old oil lamps you see in antique stores, brass frame, glass chimney, the kind you'd light with a match. The flame inside burned steady, not flickering the way you'd expect in moving air. I froze, scanning the trees around it. I didn't hear anyone. No footsteps, no voices, just the faint hiss of my own breath inside the fog. I told myself maybe someone had set it there earlier, a hunter marking his way back, though it was a strange place for it, 10, maybe 12 feet off the ground. I was about to move on when another lantern appeared ahead. Same style, same steady glow. A few yards past that, another. I stood there for a long moment thinking about my options. The trail I'd been following was to my left, but the line of lanterns angled off to the right, deeper into the fog. I should have turned back. But there was something about the light, muted but warm, the only colour in all that grey, that made it feel less like a lure and more like a guide. I told myself I'd follow just a little way, see who was leaving them. The ground here dipped and rose in shallow waves, my boots slipping a little on the damp leaves. The lanterns led me through narrow gaps in the underbrush, over an old stone wall half buried in moss, past trees that leaned toward each other like they were trying to shut out the path behind me. The fog got thicker the farther I went. It clung to my clothes, dampened every sound until my footsteps felt muffled in my own ears. Somewhere off to the side, I heard a single drop of water fall onto leaves, then another. But there was no rain. I lost count of how many lanterns I passed. Each one burned the same soft orange. Each one swayed in the same slow arc. I didn't touch them, though the urge was there, to test the heat, to make sure they were real. Eventually, the ground leveled out, and the lanterns brought me to the edge of a small hollow. The fog here was different, denser, almost luminous in the lantern light, like it wasn't just hanging in the air but standing upright, a solid wall in places. At the center of the hollow was a circle of flat stones. They were old, edges rounded, some cracked, all stained a dark, irregular shade that made me think of oil soaked into wood. I felt something in my chest shift when I saw it, a kind of pressure, like I'd stepped into a place that didn't want me there. I took a step closer, the wet leaves soft under my boots. The air smelled faintly of metal, sharp enough to catch in the back of my throat. I glanced over my shoulder. The line of lanterns I'd followed still burned steady. But as I watched, the one closest to me went out. The flame didn't flicker, it just ceased, like someone had pinched it between their fingers. Then the next one went dark. One by one, each lantern winked out, the darkness creeping toward me in silent, measured steps. I couldn't hear anything moving, but my skin prickled like the air was shifting around something. The last lantern, the one hanging directly above the stone circle, stayed lit. Its flame trembled now, as if something had finally disturbed it. The fog inside the circle stirred. It didn't drift or scatter like normal fog. It moved in a single pulse, in and out like a lung-drawing breath. The pressure in my chest got worse. My legs felt heavy. I took one step backward, then another. The lantern above me dimmed, flared once, and went out. I didn't think so. I turned and started walking fast, forcing my way through the fog where the lanterns had been, trying to remember the way I'd come. My flashlight beam cut only a short cone ahead, catching glimpses of trunks and branches that all looked the same. I don't know how long I walked before I saw the faint rise of the trail again. The fog thinned there, and the forest returned in layers, the trees, the brush, the distant slope of the ridge. When I finally looked back, the hollow was gone. Just more trees and leaves. By the time I reached my car, the fog had lifted completely, like it had never been there. I drove home in silence, my hands tight on the wheel. The next day, I convinced my friend Jared to come back with me. We left early, before the sun had burned off the morning mist. I retraced my steps as best I could, using the landmarks I remembered. The mossy stone wall, the leaning trees, the dip in the ground. We searched for hours. We found no lanterns, no stones, no hollow. It was just a forest. I thought maybe I'd imagined it, some trick of the fog and my own mind. But a week later, I woke in the middle of the night to a dim orange glow outside my bedroom window. It was gone before I could get to the glass. Story 5. Carved Faces in the Creek Bed. By the time I reached the old creek bed, the sun was already slipping behind the ridge. The air was still and cool in that hollow way it gets deep in the hills, where sound doesn't travel right. I'd taken the detour mostly out of boredom. My original trail had been washed out by a rock slide, and this dry gully looked like it might cut back toward the ridge where I wanted to be. The ground was pale and dusty, littered with smooth stones polished by years of water that no longer ran. From the way the banks rose on either side, I figured this creek must have once been wide and strong enough to carry down half a mountain's worth of runoff in the spring. Now it was just a scar of pale rock, winding and twisting like something dead. I'd been following it for maybe an hour when I noticed the first one. It was carved into a flat, half-buried slab, just a face. The mouth was open wide, lips stretched thin, the detail of the teeth chipped but still visible. The expression looked like a scream caught forever in stone. At first, I thought it was just an oddity, maybe some local artist who'd worked on river rocks for fun. But when I squatted down to look closer, I saw the edges of the cuts were smoothed, worn, not by water, but by time, decades at least. I straightened up, suddenly aware of how quiet the creek bed was. Not a bird, not a squirrel, just me, my boots grinding over the grit and the dry air. 10 feet further upstream, I saw another. This one was smaller, carved into a rock the size of a loaf of bread. The eyes were pinched shut, the brows drawn down so deep it looked like it was wincing against something unbearable. Its edges were sharper, fresher, as though the knife, or chisel, had cut it only a few years ago. I stood there a while, glancing from one to the other, feeling this strange unease in my gut. They both faced upstream. Both were tilted slightly, as though watching something that had once been there. I kept walking. The faces kept coming. Some were so faint they were nearly erased by years of dust and weather, their mouths only ghost impressions in the stone. Others were new enough that flakes of pale rock still clung to the carved lines. Every one of them faced upstream toward the head of the creek. No two were the same. Some looked afraid, some looked furious. A few, disturbingly, seemed to be smiling, not warmly, but in that stretched, desperate way you see in people who've gone too long without sleep. I don't know why I didn't turn around. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe that same impulse that makes you read the end of a letter you already know is going to ruin your day. The faces were leading me somewhere, and I wanted to see. The walls of the creek bed began to close in, rising higher, steeper, until they were more like canyon walls than riverbanks. The air cooled noticeably, and I realized I could see my breath when I exhaled. That didn't make sense. It was late summer, and I'd been sweating a few minutes before. Then I came to them. At the head of the creek, where the walls pinched together into a narrow hollow, was a ring of larger stones, each one waist-high. They formed a rough circle around a flat, pale slab in the center. Every one of the larger stones bore a carved face, and these were different from the others, bigger, more detailed, and drilled all the way through at the eyes. I could see the empty holes staring at me, black with shadow. Some had weathered, but most looked recent, edges crisp. I had the sudden, absurd feeling that they could see me as well as I could see them. I stepped into the ring, not sure why I was doing it, and leaned down to inspect the nearest carving. The stone was cold, almost wet, and the lines were cut so deeply it must have taken hours. The mouth was open, teeth bared, tongue rendered in chipped detail. As I traced one of the grooves with my fingertip, I felt it, a rush of cold air that seemed to come from upstream, from the solid wall of rock itself. Then I heard it, a faint splashing up ahead, but the creek was bone dry. My first thought was that maybe water was trickling somewhere deep underground, and I was just hearing it echo. But no, this was rhythmic, deliberate, not a trickle, more like footsteps moving through shallow water. I froze, listening. The sound came closer. I looked up at the carved faces, their drilled eyes staring past me toward the wall of rock, and then the noise stopped. I took a step back, heart hammering, and the dry dust crunched beneath my boot. That's when I realized the sound of footsteps hadn't stopped. It had changed. They weren't in front of me anymore. They were behind me, slow, heavy, matching the weight of my own steps. I turned fast, scanning the empty creek bed. Nothing, just the pale stones stretching back the way I came. I waited, straining my ears, but the sound was gone. The silence pressed in so hard it felt like a weight on my chest. The carved faces behind me seemed to be watching. I don't remember making the choice to leave. I just know that I suddenly needed to get out of that hollow. I walked quickly at first, then faster, trying not to glance over my shoulder. Every so often I'd stop, pretending to adjust my pack, just to see if I could hear it, that echo of my own steps. Sometimes I thought I did. Sometimes I thought I didn't. By the time the banks lowered and I could step out of the creek bed, the sun was nearly gone. The world beyond looked somehow wrong, though I couldn't say why. I've never been back to that place. I've never even tried to find it again. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up certain I've just heard that sound, that faint, deliberate splashing in a creek that no longer runs. And I think about all those faces staring upstream towards something I hope I never see. Story 6. The Clearing of Rope. Effigies. I never planned on going that far into the woods. It wasn't some dare or ghost story hunt, just one of those lazy, restless afternoons where my cousin Caleb and I decided to hike. He was back from college for the summer, and I think both of us were looking for a way to get away from the noise. My house had been crowded with relatives visiting, his had been under renovation, and the mountains always had a way of swallowing whatever was weighing on you. We started late, maybe around 4, with that heavy orange light spilling through the trees. Caleb had this old topo map of the area that he swore showed an abandoned logging road cutting through the ridge. He said if we followed it far enough, it would spit us out by a creek he used to fish in when he was a kid. I'd heard my dad mention that road before, said it hadn't been used in decades, and the land around it was nothing but old cut plots and half-rotted hunting blinds. The trail was barely a trail, more like a faint depression in the ground, overgrown with brambles and moss. Every few minutes we'd lose it entirely and just guess our way forward until it reappeared. Caleb was talking about maybe camping overnight, but the idea didn't sit right with me. Something about the air felt stale. I told him it was probably just the heat, but it wasn't heat. It was that kind of stillness you notice when even the bugs go quiet. We'd been walking maybe 40 minutes when I noticed the first bit of rope. Just a short, frayed piece dangling from a low branch, maybe 3 feet off the ground. It looked like it had been there forever, sun-bleached and unraveling at the ends. I pointed it out, but Caleb barely slowed down, just said, "Probably someone's old clothesline," and kept moving. A little further on there was another piece, this one tied in a crude loop, hanging from a bent sapling. That got my attention. It was too high to be a clothesline, and the knot was ugly and tight, like whoever tied it wasn't thinking about neatness. We kept finding more as we moved forward. Rope nailed into trunks. Rope dangling from branches. Rope half buried in the undergrowth, like someone had abandoned it years ago. Some of it was almost new, still stiff and pale. Others were dark with rot. By the time we found the 7th or 8th one, even Caleb stopped, pretending it was nothing. Guess someone had a thing for rope, he muttered, but his voice had that flat tone you use when you're trying to sound calm. The path narrowed until the trees leaned in so close you had to duck to get through. Then, without warning, it opened into a clearing. I can still see it, even now. The sunlight didn't reach it directly, just filtered through the canopy, giving the place this dim, greyish glow. And hanging from nearly every tree were the figures, dozens of them. They were crude, made of rope and burlap, tied off at the neck so they dangled like little hanged men. Some no bigger than a toddler, others almost my height. They swayed gently in the breeze, creaking where the rope rubbed against the branches. Whoever had made them hadn't tried for detail, just rough human shapes, arms and legs uneven, burlap stuffed lumpy like sacks of grain. Every single one was facing the same direction, inward, toward the center of the clearing where the ground was bare. That patch of dirt, I don't know how to describe it, perfectly round, maybe 20 feet across. The dirt was darker there, loose, like it had been turned over recently, and scattered across it were bones. Not just one or two, dozens, little ones. Too many for it to be a coincidence. Caleb muttered something under his breath, but I barely heard him because I was counting. Not the bones, but the figures. It was like my brain needed to know how many there were. I stopped at 30, but there were more, some tucked further back, half hidden behind trunks, all turned toward that circle of dirt. That's when I saw the first one move. It wasn't dramatic, just the barest tightening of the rope at the neck, like it had shifted its weight. Then another one across the clearing, swayed harder than the rest, too hard for the thin breeze I felt on my face. I told myself it was my imagination, but when I look back at the first one, its burlap head was angled differently. Caleb must have noticed it too, because he grabbed my arm and whispered, "Don't. Just don't." We backed up slowly, keeping our eyes on the clearing. My boot caught on a root, and I stumbled. Not a big fall, just enough to break my line of sight for half a second. When I looked up, one of the tallest figures was now facing us. The rope creaked. I don't remember the exact moment we decided to run, but suddenly we were crashing back through the trees, branches whipping our arms, rope fragments catching in our clothes. I could hear Caleb's breathing ahead of me, ragged and uneven, but I could also hear something else, soft, rhythmic thumps, like burlap brushing against bark. We didn't stop until we hit the old road again. My legs were shaking so bad I had to lean on a tree just to keep from falling over. Caleb didn't say a word, just kept looking over his shoulder like he expected to see one of those things standing in the middle of the path. We made it back to the truck before the sun dipped, but the whole drive home I kept thinking I could see something swaying in the tree line, just at the edge of my vision. The next morning, Caleb came by my house looking pale, said he didn't sleep, said he kept dreaming of rope tightening around his neck. I told him I'd had the same dream. We never went back. But a week later, I was driving past the entrance to that trail and had to stop at the intersection. That's when I saw it, hanging from a branch just 20 feet in. A rope figure, small, facing the road, like it had been waiting for us. Story 7, black, stones by the waterfall. I'd been hunting alone for years by that point, though hunting might be too generous a word for what I was doing that afternoon. The season wasn't even open yet, and I'd left my rifle at home. I just needed to get out of the house, away from the humming of the fridge, the ticking of the old kitchen clock, and the silence in between. My place sits right up against the hills, and I know enough back trails and game runs to walk for hours without crossing another person's footprints. The air that day had that early autumn sharpness to it, cold enough to make you pull your collar up, but not enough to numb your fingers. The leaves had just started to shift colors, so the whole ridge was dappled with orange and red in the sunlight. I followed a narrow deer trail I'd cut across before, one that wound through patches of laurel and boulders slick with moss. The ground was damp, the kind of damp that works into your boots and makes every step heavier. I'd gone maybe 2 miles in when I heard the water, not rushing, not the heavy roar of a real river, more like a constant, steady trickle. I didn't remember any stream running this far along the ridge. Curiosity has a way of overriding common sense out there, so I kept walking toward it. The sound pulled me off the game trail, deeper into a stand of tall pines where the needles underfoot muffled my steps. That's when I saw it. The waterfall wasn't much to look at, maybe 25 feet tall, a thin sheet of water spilling down a sheer rock face into a shallow pool. But what caught my attention wasn't the falls themselves. It was the stones at the base. They weren't the grey, jagged shale you usually find out here. These were smooth, oval and jet black, like river stones, except they were warm to the touch. I know because I knelt down and pressed my palm to one. The air was cool, the water icy, but the stone radiated heat like it had been sitting in the sun all day. And they weren't scattered. They'd been placed, arranged into a spiral that started at the outer edge of the pool and wound tighter until it ended in the center, right under the falling water. In that center, half submerged, was a tin box, rusted, dented, sealed with loops of thin wire twisted tight. I don't know what made me reach for it. Maybe just that feeling you get when something is out of place in the woods. That itch to touch it, to prove it's real. But the second my fingers brushed the wire, the sound of the falls changed. It got louder, not like a sudden rush of water, but deeper, heavier, a pounding that seemed to push the air against my eardrums. It was so loud I could feel my heartbeat trying to match it, and for a second I thought maybe it was my own pulse I was hearing. But no, it was the falls. They were pounding like rain on a tin roof, like something pressing down from above. I stood up, stumbled back, and every instinct in me said leave. I didn't look back at the spiral. I didn't take the box. I just turned and started up the bank toward the trail. That's when I saw them, 2 hikers coming down the trail I'd just stepped off of, a man and a woman. They were dressed for the weather, boots, jackets, small packs. But their clothes were the kind of thing you'd see on a department store mannequin, too clean, too neat. The man's jacket was zipped all the way to his chin. The woman's hair was pulled back so tight it barely moved when she walked. They didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't even glance at me. They just walked past, side by side, eyes fixed ahead. Their pace was slow, steady, deliberate. Like they'd measured each step before taking it, and they were headed straight toward the falls. I wanted to say something, warn them maybe, but my mouth went dry. My voice didn't seem to want to work, so I stepped aside, let them pass, and kept moving until the sound of the water faded behind me. The rest of the hike back felt wrong. The woods were quiet, but not in the peaceful way I knew. It was the kind of quiet where you feel watched. A twig snapped once, maybe 50 yards behind me, but when I stopped and turned, there was nothing. By the time I reached my truck, the sun was low enough to make the road home glow gold. I told myself I'd just stumbled on someone's odd art project, that the hikers were just strangers with bad trail etiquette, but that night I kept hearing the water in my head. Not the trickle, but the pounding. I lay awake for hours listening to it until I finally drifted off. I woke up at 3:17 in the morning. No sound in the house, no wind outside, just silence. I don't know why I looked out the window, but I did. My property's ringed by woods, and at the tree line, maybe 30 feet from the porch, I saw two shapes, standing side by side. They were too far to make out clearly, but they didn't move, didn't shift or turn their heads, just stood there, barely visible between the trunks. I stayed frozen until the first light of morning, and when I looked again, they were gone. I didn't go back to the falls for weeks. When I finally worked up the nerve, it was late October, and the air had turned sharp. I followed the same deer trail, crossed into the pines, and found the waterfall again. The stones were still there, still black, still warm. But the spiral was different. It wound outward now, starting at the center and curling toward the bank where I stood, and in the middle of that spiral was the tin box. Open. The wire was gone, and whatever had been inside wasn't there anymore. I didn't touch it. I didn't step any closer. I turned around and walked back to the truck, and this time I never once looked behind me, but every so often, when the night's quiet enough, I swear I hear water pounding somewhere in the hills. And once, on a foggy morning, I found a single black stone on my porch, still warm, even in the cold. Story 8. The Stone Table in the Pines. I grew up in a small town pressed into the folds of the Appalachians, the kind of place where the woods don't end, they just change direction. The ridges rise and fall like the bones of something ancient, and in between, the valleys hold streams so clear you can see fish flash under the stones. My whole life, I thought I knew these hills, every game trail, every old logging road. But I learned the hard way that there are parts of the forest that aren't meant to be stumbled into. It was late September the year it happened. The air had that thin chill in the morning, the kind that makes your breath show even though the sun's out. My friend Nathan and I had set out on one of our long hikes, the kind where you start with no real plan except to keep moving until you find something interesting. Nathan had this knack for finding strange places, old cellar holes from cabins long rotted away, abandoned hunting shacks, stone walls that went nowhere. He said his grandfather used to tell him stories about the hidden things in the hills, places where people did things they didn't want to find. I'd always taken it as mountain lore, half history, half superstition. That morning we were following a narrow ridge trail I'd never been on. It ran above a dark hollow where the pines grew thick enough to block the light in midday. We weren't even talking much. Just the sound of our boots in the leaf litter and the occasional jay screaming somewhere distant. Then we saw it, a break in the ridge where an old footpath dropped down into the pines. It didn't look like a game trail. It was too defined, too deliberate. The ground was worn bare in the center, lined with old stones at the edges, almost like a forgotten set of steps. Nathan grinned and said, "Now, this is what I'm talking about." And before I could argue about losing daylight, he was already heading down. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. I don't just mean fewer birds. I mean, the air itself seemed to thicken, swallowing sound. I could still hear our footsteps, but they felt muffled somehow, like walking through snow. The temperature dropped too, not enough to see your breath, but enough to make you pull your jacket tight. We came out into a clearing maybe 20 yards across. At the center of it was a slab of granite the size of a pickup bed, perfectly flat on top. The stone sat alone, surrounded by a tight ring of pines, their trunks so straight and uniform it looked unnatural. I'd never seen pines grow in such a perfect circle. We walked up to the slab. Its edges were chipped with age, and the surface was carved with deep grooves, twisting into one another like some kind of maze. The grooves weren't random. There was a pattern to them, though I couldn't make sense of it. The strange part was the moss. There was dried, almost black moss clinging to the outer edges, but the center was bare, clean, like something heavy had been sitting there not too long ago. Nathan knelt down and ran his fingers over the carvings. "These aren't tool marks," he said. "These were cut carefully. Old, too. Look at the weathering." I crouched beside him and touched one of the grooves. The stone felt faintly warm against my skin, even though the air was cool. I thought it was my imagination until Nathan pulled his hand back and looked at me like he'd noticed it too. "You feel that?" I asked. "Yeah," he said, quiet now. I set my palm flat in the center of the stone. That's when I felt it. The faintest vibration, steady, almost like the hum of machinery far underground. I jerked my hand back instinctively. There was no reason for a rock in the middle of the woods to be vibrating. I glanced around at the trees. The whole ring of pines was still. No wind, no rustle of branches. Even the distant bird calls we'd heard earlier were gone. That kind of silence doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like the woods are holding their breath. That's when I saw it. At the base of one of the pines, tucked into the shadow where roots bulged from the ground, was a pale lump. I walked over and saw it was candle wax. Creamy white, pooled and hardened against the bark. My first thought was that it had been there a while, but when I pressed my thumb to it, it was soft, still pliable. Someone had been here, recently. I stood up and looked back at Nathan, who was still studying the carvings, oblivious. Before I could say anything, I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere deep in the trees beyond the ring. They weren't in a hurry, they weren't heavy, just steady, measured crunches on the pine needles. I froze, and Nathan noticed my face. "What?" he whispered. I held up my hand in silence. The footsteps kept coming, but I couldn't tell how far away they were. The trees seemed to twist the sound, making it impossible to place the direction. Nathan stood, and we both instinctively stepped back from the stone. My heart was thudding hard enough I could hear it in my ears. Whoever was out there wasn't talking, wasn't calling out, just walking. The sound stopped. We stood there for what felt like a full minute, straining to hear anything. Then a single step, closer now. Then another. That was enough for me. "Let's go," I said, keeping my voice low. We backed toward the path we'd come in on, not turning our backs to the trees until we reached the edge of the clearing. The whole time, the footsteps never picked up pace. Just that steady, deliberate rhythm, following without following. Once we hit the trail, we turned and started moving fast. The deeper we got into the hollow, the more disoriented I felt. It was like the air itself had weight, pressing on my ears. More than once I thought I heard the footsteps behind us, but when I stopped, there was nothing. It took us longer than it should have to reach the ridge. When we finally broke back into the sunlight, I felt that pressure lift, but neither of us said a word until we were halfway back to the truck. When we finally did talk, it was short. "You felt that stone humming, right?" Nathan asked. "Yeah," I said, "and the wax." He nodded. "Someone's using it. Still." We never went back, but a week later, Nathan called me in the middle of the night. Said he'd been out driving one of the back roads near that ridge and saw two people walking along the shoulder, heading in the direction of the hollow. Said they didn't have flashlights, didn't look at his truck when he passed, just kept walking, slow and steady. I told him not to follow. I still think about that stone sometimes. And I wonder, if we'd stayed a few minutes longer, would we have seen who was coming? Or would we have ended up part of whatever was written in those grooves? Story 9. Tracks, leading nowhere. Fresh snow muffled everything. No wind, no creak of branches, just the hush that settles over the hills after a heavy snowfall. I'd been walking the ridge trail for close to an hour when I spotted them. Footprints, one set heading off the main path, barefoot. Each print was deep, toes splayed as if whoever made them had been putting their whole weight down. It was maybe 10 degrees out. No one should be walking like that without boots, not out here. I stopped and just stared for a while, the cold biting at my cheeks, watching my own breath fog in the air. I don't know why, but I stepped off the trail and followed. Maybe I thought someone was in trouble. Maybe I was curious in the wrong way. The prints wound between the trees in a strange, deliberate line. They didn't wander, didn't meander like an animal or a lost hiker. They cut straight through the woods, each step perfectly spaced. I followed for about a quarter mile before they just stopped. No sign of the person turning around, no scattering of snow, no break in the pattern. Just an empty clearing with the last footprint sitting there in the open like it had been stamped into place. At the center of the clearing was a small bundle of sticks tied with red twine. The color popped against the white snow, too bright, too clean to have been lying there long. I crouched down, brushing powder off it. The sticks were arranged in a crisscross pattern, tight and deliberate. Not random like something the wind might do. That's when I heard it, the crunch of snow behind me. Slow, measured, like someone trying not to be heard but failing. My whole body locked up, and I turned my head just enough to scan my peripheral vision. Nothing. The trees stood still and dark, their limbs heavy with snow. I stood, the bundle still in my hand, my breath loud in my own ears. The sound came again. A step, then another. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far enough away for comfort. I spun around fully this time. Empty. The clearing looked exactly as it had before. The silence afterward was worse than the footsteps. It was a heavy, pressing kind of quiet, the kind that makes you feel like the air itself is listening. I set the bundle back in the snow where I'd found it, careful not to untie it, and backed toward the edge of the clearing. When I turned to leave, there were new prints in the snow, barefoot, leading into the trees from the opposite side of the clearing. They hadn't been there a minute ago. I didn't think so. I just ran, my own boots pounding the trail I'd made coming in, the sound of my breathing almost drowning out the faint, steady crunch following me. I didn't stop until I saw my truck parked at the trailhead, a small, frost-covered shape in the pale afternoon light. I yanked the door open, climbed inside, and locked it, sitting there with my hands gripping the wheel until I could feel the heat from the vents thaw my fingers. When I glanced back toward the trail, the snow was untouched. No footprints, not mine, not anyone's. Story 1. The circle of burned stumps. I'd been hiking alone for most of that day, somewhere between where the Miller's Ridge trail marker used to be and the miles of unmarked forest that went on well past it. Most folks don't bother with that stretch anymore, not because it's dangerous, but because it's overgrown to the point of being miserable. Every step is a fight against brambles, tangled roots and saplings growing where the path used to be. Still, there's a quiet in those woods I can't seem to find anywhere else. The kind of quiet that's not the absence of sound, but the presence of something older, heavier. It was early October, the air cool but damp, the way it gets right before the leaves give up and drop. I remember the ground being soft, my boots sinking just enough that they left deep prints. I'd been following what I thought was a game trail, though it seemed too worn for deer and too narrow for the few hunters who wander this far. It was more like a depression in the earth, subtle, easy to lose if you weren't looking for it. I'd already been walking it for over an hour when I realized I hadn't heard a single bird since I'd left the last marked trail. Not one. The first sign that something was off wasn't the clearing. It was the air. It got warmer, almost noticeably so, though the sun was still low enough that it hadn't burned through the treetops. It wasn't a normal shift either. The warmth seemed to come from the ground, like a faint heat radiating up through the damp soil. I thought maybe I'd stumbled near a spring, or that there was something geological, heat trapped under rock. But that didn't feel right. The clearing appeared without warning, like I'd just stepped out of one world and into another. No gradual thinning of the trees, no warning gap in the brush. One moment there was wall-to-wall timber, the next open space, and in the middle of that space were 9 tree stumps. They'd been cut clean, no jagged splintering, no rot, but each one was charred black, as though they'd been burned long after they were felled. The black wasn't just surface ash either. The burn went deep into the wood, almost glossy in places, and carved into each stump was a series of markings I'd never seen before. Not letters, not numbers, symbols, each one different, but all done with the same careful hand. The stumps formed a perfect circle, and in the center was a shallow pit. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. The soil inside was darker than the rest of the clearing, almost muddy, though there'd been no rain in over a week. Kneeling at the edge, I touched the dirt and found it was damp. Too damp. I don't know why I decided to touch one of the stumps. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the same urge that makes you peek into an abandoned house, even when you know you shouldn't. My fingertips brushed the carved surface, and for a moment, I froze. The wood wasn't just warm, it was alive. A faint vibration pulsed under my skin, steady, like a weak heartbeat. I jerked my hand back, but the sensation lingered in my fingers, a low thrum that faded only after I wiped them against my pants. That's when I heard it, a whistle, not loud but clear, carrying through the still air. It rose, then fell, slow and deliberate, and it matched my breathing. At first I thought it was the wind, some strange resonance through the trees, but the cadence was too exact. I held my breath, and the whistle stopped. I wanted to leave, but running in the woods, especially on uneven ground, is a good way to twist an ankle or worse. So I forced myself to walk, slow and steady. As though I hadn't noticed anything wrong, my boots crunched over dead leaves, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet. After maybe 50 yards, I heard another crunch. Behind me, a second set of footsteps keeping pace. I didn't look back. Every nerve in my body screamed to, but I kept my head forward, eyes locked on the faint path that led back toward where I thought the main trail was. The footsteps followed for the entire stretch. Not rushing, not closing the distance, just there. Every time I sped up, they sped up. When I slowed, they slowed, and then, as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. By the time I saw the faded blue trail marker nailed to a leaning pine, I was almost shaking with relief. I stepped onto the main trail and risked a glance behind me. There was nothing, no one, just the narrow break in the brush I'd come through, now looking smaller and darker than it had when I entered. That should have been the end of it. But the real reason I've never gone back, the part I don't tell people when they ask why I stopped hiking Miller's Ridge, happened later that night. I'd gotten home, showered, and tried to shake the feeling. Told myself it was just the woods playing tricks on me, that the warmth was some natural phenomenon, that the footsteps could have been an animal. I almost believed it, until I walked past my living room window around midnight. The glass was dark, reflecting my own face, but beyond that, at the edge of the yard where the woods start, I saw a shape, not a person exactly, too still, too wrong, but it stood just far enough back that I couldn't make out details. I froze, watching, and after a long moment, it lifted something to its lips. a whistle. Low, slow, rising and falling. I stepped back from the window, heart pounding, and when I looked again, the shape was gone. I didn't sleep that night, and I haven't walked an unmarked trail since.